Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. And don't forget to get yourself that really perfect drink, whatever it is. I hope it's lovely and hot and soothing and comforting for this freezing cold weather out there. And wherever you are, let me know about it. What's the weather like in your part of the world? So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I was certainly not comfortable with taking in a lodger, but I soon realised I really didn't have an option in the matter. That is, if I wanted to perpetuate the privilege of living in my detached 50s home outside of Seattle. My previous tenant, the ailing Mrs. Lansbury, was an elderly woman who eventually had moved to a nursing home. She had become incredibly frail, feeble and wasted in recent years. And then after taking a nasty tumble down my staircase, she had fractured her hip very badly. Inevitably, after the hip replacement surgery she had received, followed by extensive physiotherapy, you would have expected her to recover swiftly. But not so. Things went steadily downhill from thenceforth. Instead, she became enfeebled and debilitated, so through no choice of her own, had been actively encouraged by her paediatrician to receive ongoing frail care from a nursing home. Ostensibly, it had broken my heart, as Yvette Lansbury had become like a quintessential grandmother figure in my life. I dreaded the unpalatable, inexpedient prospect of some perfect stranger moving into my home that I didn't even know anything about. I was certain their objectionable presence would be intrusive and invasive. I loathed the prospect of being uncomfortable in my own home, but it seemed infinitely more preferable than having to sell up and move away to somewhere a lot smaller, so I was really running out of options. I had lived in my current home for over 30 years, raising both my daughters here, so even the walls and very foundations of this place evoked wistful, nostalgic memories of my children's fleeting, evanescent childhoods. I say fleeting, for children grow up all too quickly. Before you know it, they're married and raising children all of their own. I had to pinch myself and wonder where all the transient time had got to, as it had slipped away as butter does on a corn cob, really fast. My husband had tragically, fortuitously passed away from a brain aneurysm in this house over 15 years ago, so I had been left a widow for what seemed like a lifetime now. I was now far too intractably set in my ways to ever consider getting married again. Besides, I didn't want to, and I had begun to enjoy my personal space in my own home, and to appreciate my independence. To all intensive purposes, living in this charming house that beheld so many poignant happy memories would never be easy to sell. I lived in a companionable neighbourhood where people were on first-name terms with each other. It was a lively, convivial community, close to a local town with excellent shopping opportunities, eclectic boutiques, fascinating bookshops, antiques, cafes and restaurants. Yet where I lived was still very rural and rustic, as the houses on the right-hand side of my street overlooked a viridescent woodgrove, made up primarily of tall, statuesque Douglas firs and ponderosa pine trees, that sprawled out for many miles into an area of magnolious, splendiferous national forest. I didn't even have a dividing wall in my backyard, which really meant this forest was an extension of my own home. Over the years I had thoroughly enjoyed a plethora of local indigenous wildlife visiting us regularly. One year a mother mountain lion had brought all 3 of her cubs to play in my yard. They were romping and clowning around on our back porch. The mother grooming her young appeared unfazed, undaunted and untroubled by my presence, as I watched the cat family on the opposite side of the window. I remember me and my 2 daughters, Tally and Rona, watched in fascination as these mountain lions grew from the cutest timorous kittens into rarely formidable, magnificent mountain lions. I mean, we saw them growing up, from kitten to cat. It was better than any wildlife documentary you might watch on television. We had grown very attached to those wild cats that over the years had dropped around to my backyard to reminisce, and also to investigate the area where they'd interacted and engaged with each other as younger cubs. I always knew which cat was which by their distinctive markings. We had named them all, so I could tell if the cat visiting us was Sabo, Serengeti or Safari. or was the original Mother Sago. On many occasions I'd seen foxes, black bears, even deer, and on one occasion a mother grizzly, all scampering around my lawn at some point in time. My resplendent yard boasted an opulent rich orchard with pear, plum, apple and peach trees that exponentially helped to invite the wildlife onto our property, along with a plethora of rather exotic fruit-eating birds, which I would watch transfixed for hours at a time from my swinging chair on the back porch, while thoroughly enjoying a Manhattan or margarita cocktail. Life didn't get better than that. It was hardly a wonder I didn't want to leave my home. I was fortunate to have a silvery pond that my late husband had constructed. It was surrounded by weeping willow trees and scattered with the most gorgeous pink water lilies. So let's just say having a natural watering hole for the animals was also another obvious attraction for the wildlife. My house was a prepossessing double-storey, pretty symmetrical white-bricked house with a grey slate roof and generous French windows. I'd given it that quaint, rather enchanting, quintessential English country cottage feel to it by growing rambling clusters of pink-climbing roses on the exterior front wall. The individualistic houses on our street ranged from elegant Victorian, Queen Anne, Craftsman, 50s, 80s, and your more popular ranch-style homes. Most of the properties had decent-sized front and back yards, with perfectly manicured verdant green lawns and flower beds full of clusters of colourful perennial flowers in season. The asphalt road on our street was fringed by neatly laid red brick pavement, with large elm trees on either side of the road, so it was a very pretty neighbourhood to live, with houses that went on the market fetching steep prices, embodying the epitome of town meets country. It was on a Tuesday morning when I started to interview some potential tenants interested in letting out a room in my home. I knew this wasn't going to be an easy exercise, as I'd heard some horror stories of unruly, rowdy tenants renting out rooms in people's houses that on the surface appeared to be very amenable. But the package does not always reveal the contents, as a person's character is not always pronounced on your first acquaintance. It's a little like going to the grocery store, picking out what you consider to be the best avocados, but I can't recall the amount of times I've opened up a perfectly good avocado to discover it's rotten on the inside. Interviewing tenants is a little like playing blind man's buff, or pulling out a lucky ticket from a magician's hat, hoping you have got lucky this time. The first woman who I showed around my home and interviewed was a young lady called Adele in her 20s. She looked like one of those bohemian swinging 60s hipsters, with long dark hair and a long dress which she wore over black leggings. She possessed a carefree, nonchalant attitude, as if she didn't have a care in the entire world. She asked me if I was all right with her keeping a pet. Now, I'm not adverse to domestic pets, but when I discovered that she had a 5-metre python that was so enormous, I knew there was no way I could have a tenant like her living with me along with that unorthodox pet slithering around my home. By all accounts, she was attached to the python, describing it to me as the most beautiful pet that she'd ever owned. She brought it out of her trunk to introduce the thing to me, which she wrapped cordially around her neck. Granted, it was a magnificent specimen, with beautiful brown markings. She told me that she slept with her python every night, but recently she had made changes to her sleeping arrangements after a horrifying revelation from her vet. I was terribly worried about poor Percival here. She's so delightful. The poor darling hadn't eaten for 2 whole months. He was losing a ton of weight. It seemed he was refusing to eat. He had absolutely no interest in food. It must have been 2 months and he hadn't eaten a single thing. I thought he must be terribly sick. Naturally, I was beside myself with worry. Well, that is rather unnerving, I admitted, especially when a pet doesn't eat. And with an exotic pet like yours, it's even more enigmatic. You won't believe what my vet told me. I could hardly absorb it myself. He told me that the reason that my little Percival here had not eaten for so long is because he's been preparing for a very large meal. And the meal is me. He's literally been starving himself so that he can eventually make room for me. I was gobsmacked. You mean your pet has not been eating so that he can end up eating you? That's exactly right, she said. Now, I don't hold it against Percival, of course. I mean, how could I? It's not something I take personally. He's such a beautiful specimen, and I'm sure that underneath it all, he really does love me. I'm not sure wanting to eat your owner is my idea of love, I'd said. But surely you're not going to sleep with him now that the vet has told you why he's not been eating for very long. I hope you've heeded his warning. No, I'm not going to sleep with him at night. It's an awful pity, but what can I do about it? My friends for ages have been telling me I'm far too attached to Percival, and that sleeping entwined with a snake every night is not perhaps the best idea. Well, I think your friends are right, I said. You don't know what the snake could get up to while you're fast asleep. What is the saying? When the cat's away, the mice do play. Hypothetically, when you're out for the count, the same symbolism seems to apply. You're right about that. I'm going to be very straight and to the point. How do you feel about me and Percival moving in? We won't be any trouble, I assure you. Percival is a very contented snake. He's very happy when he finds somewhere warm to sleep. He'll curl up and be very content. I had dreadful visions of finding Percival curled up in a dryer after I'd done a load of washing, or lying by my range when I was cooking a pot of beef soup. It wasn't a pretty picture by any manner of means. I tried to smile at the young lady. I'm afraid my smile seemed rather forced and insincere. Look, you're a terribly nice lady. Adele, she reminded me. Oh yes, Adele. Forgive me, I'm not good with remembering names. Now, I like you, Adele, very much. Percival is also a fine, spectacular snake. I need only look at him to know this is the case. But I'm afraid Percival is a contentious, controversial issue for me. Your vet's horrifying revelations about Percival's intentions to eat you up, shall I say, are ever so slightly disturbing. If Percival got out during the night, he could end up dining on me, or worse still, my domestic tabby Esther. I just couldn't allow that to happen. You must understand, it's a very bad idea. Well, you could lock your cat away, couldn't you? Then Percival won't get to your cat. And if you sleep with your bedroom door shut, it shouldn't be a problem. That's a high risk for me, I'm afraid, Adele. Number one, this is Esther's home. Why should I lock my cat up? Number two, I like to sleep with my door slightly ajar. And even if I didn't, Percival could be cosily coiled up under my bed. It's very warm under there. I could wake up in the night with him slithering all over me, coiling his long girth around my neck. Oh, the very thought, it's just too dreadful to even comprehend. I'm sorry, I really am, Adele. You're a nice girl, but it's an absolute no from me. Why is everyone so against Percival? Piped Adele indignantly. It's blatant discrimination being prejudiced against an exotic animal. You wouldn't be feeling the same way if I had a tank of goldfish or a cat, would you? Probably not, but your snake is a liability or a risk I'm not prepared to take, Adele. I'm sorry, I can't have that snake under my roof. I'd never sleep comfortably in my bed at night. Well, thanks very much, said Adele, stomping out of my house. Me and Percival are being victimised, she said. It's not right. You're being unreasonable. The next lady I interviewed was a feisty woman called Tammy, with a short sweep of ginger-coloured hair. At first I thought she seemed quite amenable, until she promptly walked into my kitchen with an audacious confidence, opening up my fridge like one of those condescending diet experts you see on those ghastly weight-loss television programmes. I can see when I move in, she dictated, there are going to have to be a lot of changes around here. For a start, this ice cream in your freezer has got to go. And as for your pop-up tarts, your Toblerone and your strawberry jelly, they need to be binned at once. No one should have these atrociously unhealthy things in their store cupboard. Do you realise how bad chocolate is for your health? If you want to eat chocolate, by all means do. But you need to eat the dark stuff. This Toblerone, no, it's not good. She looked at me disdainfully through her purple-rimmed glasses, rather like a patronising snobby schoolmistress, reprimanding a wayward student for misbehaving atrociously. You may be very slim, my dear, but don't be fooled by your outer appearance, which can be dubiously misleading and deceptive, as I'm always warning people. You don't know what's going on inside your body. You mark my words, your internal organs are screaming for healthy foods. I'll revamp your lifestyle. Your health will improve exponentially, she declared. You'll be a brand new woman by the time I've finished with you. You'll be so glad I moved in. I'll introduce you to the pleasures of transcendental meditation and yoga. Oh, my word, you'll feel fabulous. Do you know I drink wheatgrass every morning and make a berry smoothie with kale? I'm sorry, Tammy, you won't be moving in. I'm not going to swap my lifestyle for blueberries and wild oats, I'm afraid. I'm looking for a tenant that complements my lifestyle, not conflicts with it. Tammy looked at me in horror. You're in denial, are you not? If you continue to eat all this dreadful ice cream and chocolate, all these unhealthy foods could make you dead in 10 years. I'm not worried about that, I told her. I'd rather die happy than miserable nibbling my way through a plethora of carrot sticks every year. I've nothing against healthy eating, but someone dictating how I should live my life is World War III in the making. Besides, if you tell me to give up chocolate, I don't know what you're smoking. Chocolate is one of life's richest pleasures that I'm not about to give up any time soon. The irony is this woman who was lecturing me a dime to a dozen looked as if her all-natural lifestyle had made her as miserable as hell, for there wasn't even a glimmer of happiness on her sultry face, but this determination to live by a rigorous regime that was not clearly making her happy. May I ask you something, Tammy? Go ahead, said the woman. As you can see, I'm an open book. What you see is what you get. One thing about me is there are no secrets. I can see that, I said, and it's refreshing. Tell me, Tammy, are you happy? What a strange question to ask. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Well, is your lifestyle making you happy? Isn't there a little moment when you don't fantasize about a piece of chocolate cake? I mean, you're awfully self-disciplined. You say that as if it's a bad thing. But discipline is my entire life. Yes, of course I dream about chocolate cake all the time. But the big difference between you and me is that I never give in to the temptation. Never, ever. Not even for a fleeting second. As for happiness, that's an adjective. What's that supposed to mean anyway? I don't think anybody is happy all the time. They just get on with their lives, don't they? You know what, I think you're tough on yourself, Tammy. I think you should treat yourself sometimes. Give in to temptation once in a while. We only live once. I watched Tammy leaving my home. Ironically, I felt rather sorry for her. I could sense that there was a trapped wildcat inside her, wanting to come out, but she was bound by a terrifying fear of committing a cardinal sin, eating something considered unhealthy. I couldn't help thinking that it's the consummate extremes in life that make us unhealthy. It seemed to me Tammy's extreme thinking in regards to her lifestyle and healthy eating was robbing her of the freedom of choice and balance, which in itself is not healthy. The third person applying to my advert was a young man who was very polite and civil. He told me his name was Oliver, and compared to the last two tenants, he seemed so refreshingly normal. He didn't own an exotic pet, nor was he fixated by a rigid dietary regime. I remember secretly thinking, thank God! He was very interested in my property, most especially the woodgrove in the backyard, which he asked if he might inspect. I told him to be my guest, and he returned to say that the woodgrove was most suitable for his needs, which I thought was an odd thing to say, as while he would enjoy the benefits of walking in the woodgrove, it was my bedroom he was renting. I've lived around here all my life, he told me, but the house where I'm staying is being refurbished by the current landlord. I'm looking for temporary accommodation. Your bedroom and bathroom ensuite will suit me very nicely. So if you'll have me, I'm very, very keen. I do like the whole situation here. It suits me down to the ground. The word temporary rang in my head joyfully, so I found myself agreeing for Oliver to move in forthwith. Most of the time I barely even knew he was here. He was always out during the day, returning late every night. In truth, he was as elusive as the Scarlet Pimpernel, but that suited me absolutely fine. Oliver would leave the house every day, locking his bedroom door behind him, insisting that he would clean his own personal space himself. But soon after he moved into my bright, normally sunny home, with its convivial, warm atmosphere, it was as if a cloying, oppressive darkness had suddenly descended over the place. I began to have this ongoing, unsettling feeling that I was being watched all the time, by predatory, menacious eyes that I couldn't see, that would send cold shivers of trepidation darting down my spine. Sometimes in my peripheral vision I was almost certain I'd seen a dark shadow, but when I turned around to look, nothing was there. This kind of experience has never happened to me before. It would leave me wondering if I was actually losing my mind. I must confess I was heartily relieved when my best friend Bobby popped around for tea. He seemed so uncomfortable in my kitchen, his eyes darting around my home like an alarmed ferret. He shivered and looked at me with a bemused expression on his face. "What's going on here, Janine?" he asked me. "What do you mean?" I'd asked, looking nonplussed. "I don't know. You tell me. Your house feels very different, not as cosy and warm as it usually does." "In what way?" I asked. "I'm not sure, but it feels as if something is watching us. Have you made any changes to the house recently?" "No, I can't say that I have, although I do have a new tenant." Bobby frowned. "I tell you, I don't like you having strangers staying here at your home. You know nothing about them. What do you know about this tenant of yours?" "Nothing," I said. "That's my point, Janine. Your house feels heavy, bodeful, very gloomy. This isn't good. You need to keep a firm eye on this Oliver character. There's something distinctly off about your home, but I can't put a finger on it yet. If the energy shifted in your home soon after Oliver moved in, what does that say about him? Maybe he's not all he seems." "But he's in his early 20s. He seems a nice character, polite and very well dressed." "That doesn't mean anything, Janine. Surely you know that by now. Outer appearances can be very deceptive. I'm sure Ted Bundy looked presentable, but it doesn't mean he actually was. Did this young man have any character references from previous landlords by any chance?" "Well, I didn't ask for that." "Well, you should have. It's always a good idea to check on someone's character, Janine. You don't know who's living in your house." I must admit, Bobby's ominous words had disturbed the cockles of my mind, ruffling my feathers a wee bit. But I reassured myself that Oliver was a young man in his 20s. By all accounts, he was a graciously courteous person who worked in town during the day at the local bakery. There was nothing untoward about him that raised a red flag to me, as he looked as normal and regular as your average 22-year-old. In truth, he was very debonair and conservatively dressed, as well as well-spoken. I reassured myself that perhaps houses need to adjust to the energy of new people, which was why my house was slightly off-centre at the moment, but it would soon settle down. I will admit that there were strange, outlandish things that began to occur in my home that could not be explained, all aligning with the time that Oliver moved into my property. One morning I distinctly remember making up my bed, but when I returned to my bedroom, the bed covers had been ruffled up, as if I'd been sleeping there. I stood there in the doorway wondering if I was losing my mind. I was absolutely certain I had made my bed only moments before, but it was all completely messed up now. I could hear my cat crying. To my amazement, I found poor little Esther trapped in my closet, looking very disgruntled. When she saw me, she hissed, lashed out with her paw, scratching me on my arms, drawing blood, then scurried down the staircase like a bullet, as if something had scared her half to death. Nothing ever riled the fur of my lackadaisical, carefree, silver-grey cat, but something had upset her so much, to such an extent that I never saw sight or sound of Esther for 2 more days, which was most out of character for her. She usually waddled from the bed to her feeding bowl throughout the day, only ever venturing to the cat litter tray whenever she needed to attend to business. The vet had told me if I didn't get her to exercise a wee bit more, she could join the realms of the morbidly obese any time soon. One night I woke up to see a dark, shadowy figure with malicious, vindictive red eyes staring at me at the end of my bed. But it happened so fleetingly and so fast, I was almost convinced that I'd imagined it. I was so disorientated and confused, wondering if I'd experienced some kind of heinous, lucid nightmare. The umbrious figure had seemed so real. Those red eyes had been hauntingly menacious and threatening, but I couldn't be sure at all if it had been a hallucination of some kind or not. I climbed out of my bed cautiously, in a bewildered, befuddled, rather vague state. My mind seemed to be drawing 6s and 7s, part of me absolutely certain that I'd been visited by a demonical entity of some kind. Even now the hauntingly vivid, grotesque, hideous, disembodied image kept resurfacing in my mind again and again, like a video image you can't relinquish. I promptly decided that I'd go downstairs to fix myself a much-needed cup of coffee to calm myself down. I was too bemused about what I had or had not witnessed moments before to react in an appropriate way accordingly to what I'd seen. Should I be petrified, But if it was just a random nightmare, then it was water off a duck's back, surely. Nothing to get my knickers in a twist about. I tiptoed out of my room onto the landing so as not to awaken Oliver, who would need to be getting up early in the morning for his shift at the bakery soon. It was tenebrously dark on the landing. No moonlit shadows softened the gloomy twilight. I was enveloped and hugged by what I can only describe as an inauspicious, bodeful feeling that got my heart thundering in my chest so fast that I could hear every single beat. I sensed something was seriously off. I got the overwhelming sense that I was being watched by something intrinsically evil, rather like the demonical entity I'd sensed before, at the end of my bed. I could feel an ominously heavy presence that made me recoil in horror. A curiosity of note consumed me, while the hair at the back of my neck stood up on end, rather like the prickles from a hedgehog. There was an unfavourable flickering light coming from beneath Oliver's bedroom door. I tiptoed over to it cautiously, realising that this light I was seeing must be emanating from a candle of some sort. How extraordinary, I thought. The man was up. I could hear a low mumbling chanting sound coming from his bedroom. I decided that he was doing some kind of meditational mantra. Maybe he was a yogi, I thought. It was all rather odd. He didn't strike me as a yogi. He was far too uptight for that kind of lifestyle. I put my ear to his door, as my curiosity continued to be aroused. As I did this, something pushed me violently hard, so that I was flung from Oliver's door across the landing, nearly taking a tumble down the sweeping staircase. Something had definitely pushed me. But what? It had been a physical push, but Oliver was behind the bedroom door. So something else had literally pushed me. It scared the living hell out of me. What on earth was going on? I would talk about it with Oliver in the morning, but by the time I woke up, he had long since left the house for his bakery job. The following night I retired to bed, long before Oliver returned home, which wasn't unusual. I couldn't ask him any questions about the burning candle, or the baffling incongruous chanting sounds that came from his bedroom, but I was very concerned with having been pushed away from his door like that by an invisible, forceful hand. I was awoken from my deep sleep to the click of Oliver's bedroom door being closed behind him, the key being turned and twisted in the lock. He had returned home late as usual, as my clock registered 11:30 at night. The young man had been out all day. I assumed he was going to sleep, but there was something inscrutable, nebulous and clandestine going on with him. Whatever paradoxical and ambiguous thing it was, I certainly needed to get to the bottom of it, but it would have to wait, be put on the back burner, so to speak, as the young man must be exhausted, I thought. I awoke a while later to another peculiar sound that grabbed my attention. I wasn't sure what it was, but it gave me an uneasy feeling. I sat up in my bed, my ears standing up, rather like an alert guard dog. Esther, my cat, who was lying curled up in my arms, let out an ominous growl. Again, behaviour very contradictory to a nonchalant, dispassionate cat who was never ruffled up by anything. I untangled myself from the cat's body, reaching for my dressing gown, which I wrapped around me, and put on my slippers. I briefly glanced at my bedside clock. It was now 12:30 at night. I had woken up a full hour later. I was standing in my doorway when I saw a hooded figure carrying a paraffin lantern in his hands, gliding down the sweeping staircase. I knew it had to be Oliver, but what was he doing at this time of the night? I quickly trailed behind him, trying to be as discreet as possible. I could see his hooded figure, along with several others just like him, all carrying similar lanterns, disappearing into the woodgrove, one after the other in a straight line. They were up to something nefarious, I thought, but what? My hackles began to rise as I quickly threw on a pair of sneakers and a headlamp and ventured out into the woodgrove for myself. I needed to find out what Oliver was embroiled in, and what these hooded, mysterious, dark-cloaked figures actually were. It wasn't too dark a night, I'm glad to say. There was a full moon gracing the firmament. Its gentle silvery shadows warmly dappled the backyard in a soft ethereal light that offered a small measure of comfort, while the twinkling stars in the velvety sky seemed to dance in the twilight, rather like diamonds from heaven. The night was filled with the chorus of crickets and frogs, while in the distance the wailing sound of wolves could be heard. Their echoes travelled far and wide across the woodgrove. I nearly jumped out of my skin when an owl flew past me and let out a very pronounced hoot that was so close, too close to call. I trailed behind the murky, spooky silhouettes with a stealthful resolve, an unrelenting steely determination. It was easy to follow them. The wavering lights of the lanterns highlighted the way. I promptly switched off my own headlamp to avoid detection. I tiptoed, taking care to be as quiet as possible. I had never ventured out into the woodgrove at night before. It seemed strangely inauspicious, very menacing, as if a formidable, heavy blanket had cloaked the woodgrove in a thick, clawing ambience. It was almost as if the trees were whispering, "Get out! Get out!" as if I was unwelcome in this place. There was a slight breeze blowing through the tall ponderosa pines and Douglas fir trees, which meant that they jiggled their needled boughs, rather like reluctant dancers. But the movements of the trees were woefully discomposing, for something about this night left the hairs on the back of my neck still standing on edge. Still, I was out here now. I needed to see what Oliver was getting up to, in the woods at night. I crept on the earthen floor. It felt pleasantly soft under my feet. I made sure not to lose my footing over a fern or a lone rock, or slip over some moss, which can easily happen. I finally stood behind a tree, watching all the cloaked figures settle down in an open clearing, forming a small circle. I counted over 12 hooded figures. What was this, I wondered? Some kind of devil worship? Such a thought was very distressing and discomposing for me. It certainly would explain some of the untoward activity that was going on in my home at the moment, that I'd put down to an overactive imagination. Now I wasn't so sure. Was Oliver conjuring up demons, I wondered? I watched with bated breath as the figures began chanting what sounded like some kind of demonical worship in a language rather like Latin, but they kept saying, "Hail, Lucifer! Hail, Lucifer!" and bowing their heads in worship. Then one of the robed figures stood up, and in his hands he held a huge white chicken that was clucking away noisily and making a terrible commotion. He twisted the chicken's neck, throwing the decapitated head on the forest floor, where it landed not far away from where I was standing. The man tore the feathered creature apart, squeezing blood into a large silver ornate goblet, which was then passed around from one hooded figure to the next, in order to drink, while the blood-soaked feathers were flying all over the place, rather like confetti, and scattered across the forest floor. "We present this offering to you, great Lucifer," boomed the voice. "We honour you with our praise and thanks and glory." All of a sudden I heard a loud thumping sound. Something hugely heavy and portentous was moving through the forest at an alarming speed. The only way I can describe it to you is it sounded like a trampeding elephant in musk barging through the woodgrove. The forest suddenly became submissively silent and subdued. Even the crickets and frogs ceased singing. Whatever it was, even before I saw it, I knew that it had to be gargantuan in size, for every single footstep on that forest floor caused the trees to shake, the ground to heave and groan. "It's working!" cried one hooded figure. "It's working! Lucifer is coming! He's received our sacrifice!" I remember my blood turned cold as ice. My whole body began to tremble like a jiggling jello. Had these hooded figures called up the devil himself, I wondered? It seemed more than likely, for I could sense a formidable, threatening presence venturing towards us, getting ever closer. I could also sense a powerful energy. Then I saw it. Nothing prepared me for what I was seeing, as the tall, dark, shadowy silhouette moved towards the large circle of hooded figures with a deliberate, purposeful intent. At first, I really did think it was a demon from hell. Then I realized this intimidating, awesome silhouette that was easily 9 foot tall, built like a giant, covered with long, flowing black hair that was blacker than the night, was, in fact, a Bigfoot. The Bigfoot was absolutely furious. His anger was so tangible I could almost physically feel it. I have never in my life felt a rage like that before, that hit you so fiercely in the face like a block of cold ice. The creature seemed to straighten out his very long torso with pronounced shoulders. Pulling back his thin lips, he let out an ear-piercing scream that was so shrill in its frequency that it went right through me, physically causing my ears to pop, like they do when you go on long-distance air flights. The creature began to pound his chest defiantly. but I didn't get the impression it was an egotistical maneuver on his part. It was more like he was asserting his authority over these hooded figures, telling them categorically who was boss. The Bigfoot grabbed the silver goblet, throwing its contents across the floor in disgust. He began fiercely digging a hole in the ground, grabbing the chicken and head, burying it under the earthen floor, while the hooded figures watched the creature in astonishment. I'm not sure what was going through their heads at the time, as one of the hooded figures began to chant, "Hail, Lucifer! Hail, Lucifer! Hail, Lucifer!" and the others followed on suite, chorusing, "Hail, Lucifer!" This action heightened the Bigfoot's furious frenzy, enraging him so significantly that he promptly dashed over to the hooded figure that had honoured Lucifer. He kicked him so hard with a tree-trunk-sized leg. The young man yelped out in agonising pain, while all the other hooded figures scattered in terror, grabbing their lanterns, running for the hills, their faces obscured and buried by the cloaked hoods. But I'm quite sure they were petrified. The young man that had been hit by the Bigfoot literally crawled away out of the forest, whimpering in agonising pain. The Bigfoot ignored the cloak figures. He frantically began to sweep down the whole area with his overlong arms, where moments before the hooded figures had been gathered for their cryptic ceremony. I could sense the critter was very aggrieved. He began to mutter some kind of mantra, gathering a large pile of rocks in the woodgrove together. He appeared to be placing these rocks strategically in the soil. This took quite some time, but I remained very still, watching in fascination, making sure that I remained very quiet. His human-like face looked visibly distressed. His deep-set dark eyes were benevolent and kind, seemed fired up by indignance. I discerned that this critter was incredibly upset about the devil worship. He had a clear comprehension and understanding of the spirit world, it would seem, and these cloaked figures had been doing something that had made him very unhappy. He began laying the rocks down in the ground in a deliberate, ordered, structured way, and when he had finally finished his arrangement, he stood up and examined his work, seemingly pleased with his accomplishments. He then took a lantern that someone had left behind, sprinkling the remnants of the remaining paraffin on the stones, which ignited with the fire, until it burnt itself out, almost as if it had been a cleansing ritual. I watched in amazement as the creature turned around, glided away into the heart of the forest, and as he moved away, it was like he was floating on air. I walked over to see what design the Bigfoot had imprinted in the ground. To my amazement, it was the symbol of the cross, done in a circle where the cloaked figures had been sitting, almost as if the Bigfoot had tried to extinguish the evil that they had tried to provoke. I turned around and made my way back to my home, and slipped into my bedroom, hardly daring to believe what I'd witnessed that night. It would seem my seemingly harmless tenant was steeply involved in devil worship. Now I was convinced that the hooded figure I'd seen at the end of my bed one night, with the bright, blazing red eyes, may not have been a figment of my imagination after all, but a very real demonical entity. I had in mind that in the morning I would be telling Oliver that he needed to leave my premises forthwith. I couldn't have someone under my roof engaged in devil worship. Goodness knows what kind of phenomenon he could stir up in my home. Since he'd moved in the house, it had been steeped in a conspicuous, uncongenial atmosphere. That was without a doubt. The next morning when I pottered down to my kitchen, I discovered a note and some money from my tenant Oliver, exclaiming that he had left and would not be coming back. I think that incident in the woodgrove with the Bigfoot must have scared him off. The relief I felt was immense. I called Bobby to tell him what had happened. "Oh my goodness, he's a devil worshipper. I'm coming around now. We need to examine the house to make sure there is no nefarious things lying around the place. Remember the last time I was at your house? I warned you about your tenant. I could feel a heaviness and a very powerful oppressive energy in your home. We're going to need to get the place thoroughly cleansed. I know just the person for the job. I'll give her a call." Before long, Bobby and I were examining my tenant's bedroom. We found melted black candle wax everywhere. And when I moved the rug away from the floor, there was a circular pentagram that had been carved in the wood. I could not believe the brazen audacity of it all. A pentagram in my own home. No wonder the atmosphere was so unconvivial. A lovely lady arrived hours later to cleanse my home, thanks to Bobby. She was a round, short, portly lady in her 60s, with a grey head of hair that was pinned back away from her face in a bun. She spoke in a raspy voice. Bobby had simply asked for a cleansing ceremony to be done on my home. We had revealed nothing to the woman about the nefarious activity that had been going on in my house. "Something very evil has been going on here," she said, looking at me with earnest eyes. "I can feel the presence of an open doorway, or portal if you like, where demons have been invited into your home. They have been given free permission to enter this place. The portal needs to be closed, or your house will become a living hell for you." We followed the woman around my house. She prayed and sprinkled holy water everywhere. When she entered our tenant's room, she froze to the spot. The colour drained from her face. "It is in here, the portal I can find." We showed her the pentagram. We managed to pull the offending floorboards apart out of the floor, which would have to soon be replaced. The woman told me to stand in the room and to tell any spiritual entity that they had to leave, as this was my home. "This is my house. I want you to leave. You're not welcome here. You have to go. You must leave now. This is my house. You must go. You do not have my permission to be here." All of a sudden it was as if a wind current of feisty air pummelled the entire room, but we stood firm on the spot. Then we heard the most horrifying demonical growl that put the fear of God into every cell of my body. But the woman remained stoic and continued to pray. At one time something pushed her so hard she nearly took a tumble herself, but she remained fixed on her prayer and was not easily intimidated. I was incredibly impressed. That was when we saw this black shadow darting around the room, like a huge shadow person. Then the entity morphed into a thick, smoky substance and literally meandered towards the open window, letting out a huge blood-curdling scream. Then we saw it physically gliding out of the window into the blue sky, like smoke from a chimney. "It's gone," said the woman. "It's gone, and it won't be coming back." She began to sage the entire house. "Thank you so much," I said to the woman, giving her a huge hug. "Be very careful whom you get staying in your house next time," she warned me. I'm glad to inform you that my house returned to its previous congenial atmosphere. I'm pleased to tell you that Bobby decided to sell up his old home, and he moved in with me. So now I don't have to worry about the character of potential tenants. Suffice to say, the mountain lion safari has been visiting our porch with her offspring recently. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.